Your daughter isn't on today's memorial list, Mercer. Please step away from the doorway before you create a scene. She carried one flower because Nora asked her to. Don't erase the last promise they made to each other. The white lily trembled in Lily Mercer's hands long before anyone noticed the child holding it. She stood beside her father at the entrance to the funeral home. Her fingers wrapped carefully around the stem as though squeezing too tightly might bruise the petals. In the pocket of her navy sweater rested a worn library card with softened corners, the kind that had been carried for years inside coat pockets and between favorite books. It had belonged to Nora Bell. Grant Holloway blocked the doorway with practiced composure. His black suit fit perfectly. His expression did not. Caleb Mercer kept one hand near Lily's shoulder, not forcing her forward and not allowing her to drift away. At 38, he had learned that grief could arrive disguised as silence. After losing his wife, Mara, he had rebuilt broken porches, repaired leaking roofs, and fixed neighbors' fences because broken things made sense. People did not. This isn't personal, Grant said quietly enough that the nearby guests could pretend not to hear. It sounded personal anyway. Lily looked from the white flower to the closed doors beyond the funeral director. Nora said I would help, she whispered. Grant's gaze flickered toward the child before settling back on Caleb. Today's arrangements are final. Caleb swallowed words that wanted to become anger. Nora Bell had never cared about status. She had cared about overdue library books, lonely children, and handwritten notes tucked into returned novels reminding readers that stories could keep people company after everyone else went home. After Mara died 3 years earlier, Nora had quietly become part of Caleb and Lily's small world. Every Thursday after school, she found reasons to recommend books that matched feelings Lily struggled to name. She always had hot tea waiting for Caleb when he arrived late from another repair job. She never asked him to explain why exhaustion made him stare through windows before speaking. She simply checked out another story. The library card inside Lily's pocket still carried faint pencil marks where Nora insisted children should write tiny stars beside books that made them feel brave. Now its owner lay only a few rooms away, and Lily was being told goodbye, had no place for her. Someone near the entrance lowered their voice. Someone else looked away. The moment stretched longer than anyone wanted. Caleb knew enough about pride to recognize it inside himself. He hated asking for favors. He hated depending on anyone. Most of all, he hated standing helpless while his daughter searched adult faces for kindness that never arrived. Grant remained motionless. Behind his polished confidence lived calculations invisible to everyone else. Bills stacked higher than anyone in town imagined. A business reputation balanced on fragile promises. Wealthy families expected flawless private services. Losing them could mean losing everything he had spent decades building. None of those fears excused what he was doing. But fear rarely announced itself honestly. It preferred respectable clothing. Caleb looked once at Lily. "We're leaving," he said softly. Not because Grant was right. Because Lily had already been hurt enough for one morning. One day, the truth would have to choose a side. If stories about ordinary courage matter to you, stay with this one. 2 weeks earlier, morning sunlight spilled through tall library windows, warming shelves that had watched generations grow older. Nora Bell moved slowly between them. Age had stiffened her hands, but not her memory. She remembered which children secretly preferred adventure stories, which retired farmers borrowed poetry without admitting it, and which parents checked out books they never found time to finish. She smiled when Lily entered carrying a backpack nearly as large as herself. "You brought it back already?" "I read it twice," Lily answered proudly. "I suspected you might." Caleb followed a few steps behind, dust from a construction site still clinging to his boots. He apologized for arriving late, although nobody had complained. Nora waved the apology away. "Books know how to wait." She stamped the returned novel before reaching beneath the desk. "I have another mystery for you." Instead of handing over only one book, she slid across an old library checkout card. It looked outdated, almost forgotten. "I've been creating a little code for my own records," she said with a playful smile. "Every special recommendation gets a handwritten mark. Someday someone curious might enjoy figuring it out." Lily studied the tiny symbols. "They look like secret messages. The best libraries always have one," Caleb laughed, a sound that surprised even him. For a moment, grief loosened its grip. Nora noticed. She noticed everything. Later that afternoon, after Lily wandered toward the children's shelves, Nora lowered her voice. "You don't always have to carry everything alone, Caleb. I'm managing. You are surviving." He looked toward Lily. "Same thing." "No." Nora's answer was gentle. "Surviving keeps today together. Living leaves room for tomorrow." Caleb didn't respond. Accepting help still felt too much like admitting defeat. Nora let the silence remain. Wisdom did not always require another sentence. Over the following days, she visited the town hall twice, met quietly with a local attorney once, and spent several hours organizing papers inside the library office. Everything was documented carefully. Dates, times, signatures. She believed instructions mattered because memories could become disputed. She also knew people sometimes changed once responsibility met money. When her breathing became more difficult later that week, Nora requested an appointment with Grant Holloway. She arrived carrying a slim folder, her reading glasses, and the same fountain pen she had used for decades. Grant listened while she described the memorial she hoped would comfort people instead of impress them. She spoke Lily's name clearly. She described a simple reading the child had practiced. She added one final instruction involving a modest community trust dedicated to children's reading programs, asking that its existence be acknowledged during the service because generosity grew stronger when shared openly. Grant nodded. He wrote notes. He assured her every wish would be respected. When Nora left, she thanked him. After she disappeared through the front door, Grant remained seated. Another appointment waited. Representatives from one of the town's wealthiest families arrived precisely on time. Their expectations sounded very different. By evening, Grant opened Nora's memorial planning file again. He compared it against his appointment schedule, upcoming finances, and a list of donors whose approval seemed increasingly essential. His pen hovered above the page. Then he reached for a fresh planning log. Across town, Caleb repaired a broken porch railing until sunset. Unaware that decisions made inside a quiet office had already begun changing the path toward Nora Bell's farewell. The ink had not dried yet. Nora Bell died before dawn on a morning so still that even the birds seemed reluctant to interrupt it. The news traveled through the town with unusual quiet. No one spoke of shock. Nora had been ill long enough for people to prepare themselves in practical ways, yet not nearly long enough to prepare their hearts. Teachers paused before opening classrooms. Retired neighbors folded newspapers and stared through kitchen windows. Parents found themselves remembering books they had first borrowed decades earlier. At the library, a vase of fresh flowers appeared beside the circulation desk before the doors officially opened. No one admitted bringing the first bouquet. Grant Holloway received the call while reviewing appointments. He closed his office door before anyone else arrived. Nora's folder lay where he had left it after her visit. He opened it again. Every page reflected the same careful order that had shaped her life. The memorial outline listed music, readings, and moments of silence with handwritten notes in the margins. Lily Mercer was named clearly beside a short passage from a favorite children's novel about courage found in ordinary kindness. Below that appeared Nora's instruction that the community trust supporting young readers should be announced publicly, along with the names of local volunteers who would help oversee it. Grant read each line twice. Then another folder landed on his desk. The donor family's representative had already sent revised expectations. Their contribution would cover extensive renovations the funeral home desperately needed. In return, they wanted an invitation-only service emphasizing family legacy, private remembrance, and carefully controlled attendance. They believed the memorial should remain elegant and exclusive. Children's participation, spontaneous community tributes, and additional announcements would distract from that atmosphere. Grant leaned back in his chair. His accountant's warnings echoed in memory. Late payments, mounting debt. Credit stretched dangerously thin. He looked from one folder to the other. For several long minutes he touched neither. When he finally reached for his pen, he did not cross Nora's wishes out completely. Instead, he copied selected portions into a new planning document while leaving other instructions behind. Lily's reading disappeared. The public acknowledgement of the community trust disappeared. Several community participants vanished with them. On the replacement schedule, the donor family's private reception expanded by nearly an hour. Grant signed the revised planning log and entered the timestamp with deliberate precision. He told himself the essential purpose remained unchanged. People would still gather. Nora would still be honored. Small compromises, he reasoned, sometimes protected larger responsibilities. Yet somewhere beneath those carefully arranged justifications, he recognized another truth. He had chosen convenience over fidelity. Across town, Caleb learned of Nora's death from the library's assistant director. He thanked her quietly before ending the call. For several minutes, he remained seated in his truck outside a repair job he suddenly could not remember agreeing to. Grief returned differently this time. When Mara had died, sorrow had arrived like a storm that tore everything apart at once. With Nora, it came like another stone placed carefully onto a burden already carried too long. That afternoon, he picked Lily up from school without mentioning the phone call immediately. She sensed it anyway. Something happened, he nodded once. Lily, she understood before he finished. The silence inside the truck became complete. Later that evening, they walked together to the library. A small memorial table stood near the entrance. Visitors had begun writing messages inside a remembrance book. Lily placed her white lily beside the flowers. Then she slipped Nora's worn library card from her sweater pocket. I think she'd want me to keep borrowing stories, she whispered. Caleb rested a hand gently against her shoulder. I think she'd like that very much. The memorial service announcement appeared 2 days later. Caleb unfolded the printed program while drinking coffee before work. He searched automatically for Lily's name. He searched again. Nothing. Perhaps this was an earlier draft. He called the funeral home. Grant answered with polished calm. There must be some mistake, Caleb said. Nora asked Lily to read. The final arrangements changed. Who changed them? There were necessary revisions. Necessary for whom? Grant paused just long enough for the question to become uncomfortable. The family approved the current program. Nora approved the first one. I understand your disappointment. No, Caleb answered quietly. I don't think you do. He ended the conversation before anger replaced dignity. Lily found him sitting alone on the porch that evening with the folded program resting across his knees. She read it herself. They forgot. Caleb almost corrected her. They had not forgotten. Someone had decided. Yet he could not bring himself to place that weight upon her so quickly. I'm going to ask again tomorrow, she nodded, but did not seem to hear him. Instead, she turned Nora's old library card over in her hands. The faded pencil marks along one edge caught her attention. They're different. Caleb looked closer. What do you mean? The little stars. She traced them carefully. Some have tiny numbers beside them, numbers so faint they almost disappeared into the worn paper. 1, 5, 9, 3. Not random, not shelf locations either. Lily frowned thoughtfully. Nora always said library cards, remember every book. She hurried toward the bookshelf in the living room where several borrowed novels still waited to be returned. Most carried modern printed receipts. One older volume still contained a traditional checkout pocket. Lily slid the library card inside. The pencil marks lined up almost perfectly beside a row of handwritten checkout codes stamped years apart. Her eyes widened. It's matching something. Caleb leaned closer. What? The old checkout numbers. She copied them carefully onto a notepad. The sequence pointed toward a specific catalog record format, no longer used for ordinary shelving. Nora had once explained that older catalog codes sometimes revealed more than where a book belonged. Certain librarians created personal reference systems for archives, local history, or restricted collections requiring additional logs. Caleb stared at the page. You think she left a message? I think, Lily said slowly. She wanted someone who loved libraries to find it. The next morning, Caleb visited the library before beginning work. The assistant director examined the copied sequence with growing curiosity. This isn't a regular checkout number. What is it? She disappeared into a back office. When she returned, she carried an aging catalog binder seldom touched anymore. The first section points to an archive cabinet, she explained. The second identifies a librarian's handwritten circulation index. Can we see it? She hesitated. Archive materials require authorization because they're considered historical records. Who authorizes access? Our records manager. And when can we ask? She looked toward the office hallway. He's attending Nora's memorial planning meeting at the funeral home this afternoon. Caleb exchanged a glance with Lily. Neither spoke. Somewhere inside the funeral home, people were discussing arrangements already altered without Nora's voice. Somewhere inside the library, an old archive appeared to contain the first thread she had intentionally left behind. If the code truly pointed toward records instead of books, Nora had expected someone to keep looking after she was gone. Caleb folded the copied numbers carefully and slipped them into his pocket. For the first time since Grant's phone call, grief made room for purpose. And across town, as the memorial planning meeting concluded, Grant noticed one detail on Nora's original handwritten file that he had overlooked before. A notation beside the same catalog reference Lily had just decoded. His expression changed. He reached immediately for the cabinet key. Grant Holloway reached the archive cabinet before anyone else that afternoon. He unlocked the narrow metal door with steady hands that did not reflect the unease rising inside him. The folders stood exactly as they had for years, labeled in Nora Bell's neat handwriting. He searched for the catalog reference he had overlooked. There it was. Inside rested only an index card. Written across it in blue ink were a few simple words: "Complete memorial record filed with Town Archive according to instruction." Grant closed his eyes. Nora had anticipated that important decisions might someday require proof stronger than memory. She had never accused anyone of future wrongdoing. She had simply trusted documentation. Grant returned the card to its place. Destroying it crossed his mind for only an instant. He shut the cabinet without removing a single page. Whatever mistakes he had already made, he could not persuade himself to commit another. By the following morning, Caleb and Lily arrived at the library before it opened. The assistant director had already contacted the town records manager, explaining that Nora's archival catalog reference appeared connected to official historical material rather than ordinary circulation records. The manager, Evelyn Cross, greeted them with cautious professionalism. Nora left written authorization for certain records to be opened if questions arose concerning her memorial instructions, she explained. The authorization becomes valid only after her passing. Caleb looked surprised. She planned for disagreement? Evelyn shook her head. Nora planned for uncertainty. There's a difference. She unlocked a climate-controlled archive room beneath the library. Unlike the public shelves upstairs, these rooms held ledgers, council minutes, handwritten correspondence, and decades of carefully preserved town history. Dust floated through narrow beams of morning light. Everything smelled faintly of old paper and cedar. Evelyn located the catalog code Lily had deciphered. Instead of a book, it identified a sealed archival envelope bearing Nora Bell's signature. The envelope contained copies rather than originals. Each page had been dated, witnessed, and cross-referenced. At the top lay Nora's memorial planning record. It matched the version Grant had first received. Every instruction appeared exactly as Caleb remembered hearing Nora describe them. Lily's reading remained clearly listed. The announcement establishing the Children's Reading Trust occupied its own section. Most importantly, the planning record carried a timestamp from the day Nora met Grant, followed by his signed acknowledgement that he had accepted responsibility for carrying out her stated wishes. Caleb read the page twice. He said nothing. Lily quietly reached for his hand. Evelyn continued examining the remaining documents. There are references to additional municipal records. Within the hour they visited the town clerk's office. The clerk retrieved council filings concerning charitable trusts. Nora had submitted preliminary paperwork weeks before her death. The documents identified volunteer trustees, outlined the purpose of the reading fund, and referenced the memorial announcement as the intended public introduction. Nothing required immediate funding. Nothing benefited Nora personally. Everything reflected years of careful planning for children she would never meet. Finally, they met with the attorney who had witnessed Nora's signatures. He confirmed the timeline without hesitation. Nora reviewed every page personally, he said. She wanted everything transparent. Did she ever mention changing her mind? Caleb asked. Not once. By afternoon, the facts aligned cleanly. Library archives, town records, legal witnesses, independent documentation. Each piece supported the next. No single discovery proved everything. Together they formed a chain difficult to dismiss. Grant received copies before evening. He sat alone in his office, reading them while rain tapped softly against the windows. He knew exactly what they established. They did not prove malicious intent. They proved that he had accepted Nora's instructions and later replaced them with different arrangements. His phone rang. The donor family's representative spoke first. I've heard questions are circulating. So have I. You assured us everything had been settled. I believed it had. It needs to remain settled. Grant remained silent. If this becomes public, the representative continued, Our family will not be associated with unnecessary controversy. The line went quiet again. Grant understood the unspoken conclusion. No donation, no financial rescue, possibly no future relationship. After ending the call, he looked around his office. Every polished surface represented decades of work. Every framed certificate reflected years spent comforting grieving families. He wondered at what point protecting those achievements had become more important than protecting the trust people placed in him. The answer refused to arrive. News traveled carefully at first, not through rumors, through conversations. Evelyn mentioned the archival documents to another librarian. The attorney confirmed only verified facts when asked. The town clerk explained that public trust filings had always existed for anyone willing to search the records. No one exaggerated, no one accused. People simply compared documents. By the following day, questions reached the church choir. Then retired teachers. Then volunteers who had planned to attend the memorial. Among them was Samuel Ortiz, who remembered Nora tutoring struggling readers after school long before anyone praised literacy programs. If she asked that little girl to read, he said quietly, there must have been a reason. Others agreed. Not loudly, not angrily, just steadily. Courage spread differently from outrage. Outrage demanded immediate action. Courage asked ordinary people to remain truthful, even when truth became inconvenient. Several volunteers contacted Grant directly. They requested clarification. He answered each call himself. I made adjustments under difficult circumstances. Were they Nora's adjustments? One neighbor asked. No. Were they the family's? Grant hesitated. They reflected multiple considerations. The answer satisfied no one. By evening, the donor family's involvement became impossible to ignore. One member, uncomfortable with growing speculation, admitted during a civic committee conversation that they had requested a more private service suited to invited guests. The admission contained no cruelty. From their perspective, they had simply asked for what they believed appropriate. They had never claimed Nora wanted it. They had assumed arrangements could be negotiated. That distinction mattered. Responsibility no longer rested solely on whispered suspicion. It rested on documented choices. Caleb still resisted public confrontation. He wanted Lily protected from becoming the center of conflict. But Lily surprised him. Nora didn't teach me to hide from hard chapters, he smiled sadly. No, she didn't. Saturday morning arrived gray and cool. Neighbors appeared at the library carrying flowers instead of petitions. A retired carpenter offered to help organize records if needed. Former students volunteered to copy archival documents. Parents began sharing memories of books Nora had quietly placed into children's hands when families could not afford to buy them. Without anyone announcing it, the town started gathering around Nora's truth instead of around the altered memorial program. Grant watched from across the street after leaving another difficult meeting. No one shouted at him. No one demanded his resignation. Their restraint somehow weighed heavier than accusation. He realized that if the original documents were presented before the memorial, the service he had arranged could never proceed as planned. He still possessed authority over the funeral home schedule. He still had time to make another decision. Across the square, Caleb folded Nora's planning record back into its protective folder. He looked toward the funeral home. The doors remained closed, but people had begun walking toward them one by one, not because someone summoned them, because each had chosen, quietly and independently, not to let Nora's own voice disappear. Morning settled gently over the town, carrying the quiet expectancy reserved for days that would be remembered long after their details blurred. Inside the funeral home, flowers had already been arranged with careful symmetry. Chairs stood in measured rows. Printed programs rested neatly on each seat, still reflecting the revised memorial Grant Holloway had approved days before. He held one copy in his hands. The paper felt heavier than it should. His staff sensed something unusual in his silence, but asked no questions. They had worked beside him long enough to recognize when words would only make difficult decisions harder. Outside, Caleb Mercer parked several buildings away. Lily stepped onto the sidewalk, carrying the same single white lily she had protected since dawn. Nora's worn library card remained tucked safely inside her sweater pocket. No longer simply a keepsake, but the first thread that had led them toward the truth. Neither hurried. Grief had already taught them that love could not be measured by speed. As they approached the entrance, Grant stepped into the doorway. His expression resembled the one Caleb remembered from 2 weeks earlier. Controlled, composed, carefully professional. Only his eyes had changed. "They're not listed," Grant said quietly. Caleb answered with equal calm. They were listed. For a long moment neither man moved. Lily remained beside her father, holding the flower with both hands. Behind Caleb came Evelyn Cross from the library archives. Behind her walked the town clerk, carrying certified copies of municipal filings. The attorney who had witnessed Nora's signatures arrived carrying his own notarized record book. Samuel Ortiz followed with several retired teachers. Parents came. Former students came. Neighbors came. No one pushed forward. No one raised a voice. Each person simply carried one small piece of documented truth. The line extended farther down the sidewalk than Grant expected. Not a protest. Not a spectacle. A community. Grant looked from one familiar face to another. He had served many of these families through their hardest days. He knew anniversaries they still observed. He remembered names engraved on old memorial stones. Now those same people stood patiently before him. Evelyn stepped forward first. "I've brought the archive authorization." The town clerk lifted a folder. "I've brought the public trust filings." The attorney nodded. "I've brought the witnessed planning record." No accusation followed, no speeches, only evidence. Grant accepted the folders one at a time. He already knew what every page contained. Still, he opened them. The time-stamped memorial planning record rested on top. His own signature acknowledged receiving Nora's instructions. The municipal filing matched the dates exactly. The legal witness confirmed the sequence. Nothing contradicted anything else. Years of Nora's orderly habits had quietly defeated confusion. Grant closed the folder. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual polished certainty. "I changed the program. No one interrupted. I believed protecting this funeral home required compromises." He paused. "I told myself I could honor Nora while changing the details." He looked toward Lily. "I was wrong." The admission settled across the entrance with remarkable stillness. Responsibility, once spoken plainly, required no decoration. Grant turned toward his staff. "Please stop seating guests." One employee looked uncertain. "The printed programs, we'll replace them." Another hesitated. "The donor reception?" Grant took a slow breath. "It has been canceled." Word reached the donor family's representatives within minutes. They arrived expecting argument. Instead, Grant met them personally. "I accepted your requests when I should have honored Nora's written instructions. You are changing everything now? I'm restoring what should never have been altered. The donation will be withdrawn." "I understand," he did. The consequences were no longer theoretical. They were immediate. Financial hardship remained. Public embarrassment remained. Professional scrutiny would almost certainly follow. He accepted each without attempting to shift blame. By late morning, volunteers from the library and town offices had reprinted a simple memorial schedule using Nora's original plan. No ornate language, no exclusive reception. No names elevated above others. Just the farewell she had written herself. Guests entered together. No reserved section separated wealthy families from ordinary neighbors. Teachers sat beside mechanics. Children sat beside retirees. Parents shared pews with people they barely knew. The room reflected the town Nora had quietly served for decades. When the time came, Grant walked to the front. He carried the revised program in one hand. "I owe everyone present an honest account." He described the changes he had authorized. He explained the pressure surrounding finances without presenting it as an excuse. He acknowledged that fear of losing support had influenced his judgment. Then he apologized directly. "Most importantly," he said, turning toward Lily, "I failed the person Nora trusted." He stepped aside. "Lily Mercer." The little girl stood slowly. For just an instant, uncertainty crossed her face. Caleb knelt beside her. "You don't have to be perfect." She smiled faintly. "Nora never wanted perfect." He nodded. "She wanted you." Lily walked to the reading stand, carrying both the folded page Nora had chosen and the white lily. Her voice trembled on the first sentence, then steadied. The passage spoke of libraries as places where strangers quietly left hope for people they would never meet. It described courage not as loud heroism, but as the decision to keep kindness alive after disappointment. Several listeners lowered their eyes. Others smiled through tears. Caleb watched his daughter and recognized something he had nearly overlooked while protecting her from grief. She was no longer carrying only loss. She was carrying memory. When the reading ended, silence remained for several heartbeats before anyone moved. Lily approached Nora's casket. She laid the white lily gently beside it. Then, after a moment's thought, she placed the worn library card underneath the flower. Not to give it away forever, only to let it rest there for one final goodbye before quietly slipping it back into her pocket. Some memories, she realized, were meant to keep traveling. Following the service, the attorney formally announced the beginning of Nora Bell's Community Reading Trust using the documents already filed with the town. Volunteer trustees accepted their responsibilities. The library established a small committee to recommend children's books purchased through the first donations. Samuel Ortiz offered to repair neglected reading benches outside the library. Parents organized weekly story hours. Former students pledged scholarships for young readers in Nora's name. The trust began not with great wealth, but with many modest promises kept together. Grant submitted a written statement to the funeral home's governing board that same afternoon. He included copies of every relevant document and accepted review of his professional conduct. He also met privately with affected families, including Caleb and Lily. "I cannot undo what happened," he said. "No," Caleb answered. "But you told the truth," Grant nodded. "It should have come sooner." It came before the truth disappeared. That distinction mattered. Weeks later, autumn settled across the town. The library reopened its restored reading room after volunteers completed small repairs. A brass plaque near the entrance bore Nora Bell's name without elaborate praise. Only a simple inscription. Every story becomes larger when shared. Children filled the room with ordinary conversation. Books continued leaving shelves. Books continued returning. Life continued, as Nora had always believed it should. Caleb still worked long days repairing homes, though he accepted help more often than before. When neighbors offered an extra pair of hands, he no longer refused automatically. Grief had not vanished. It had simply become something he no longer insisted on carrying alone. Lily borrowed another mystery using Nora's old library card, now preserved inside a protective sleeve. The assistant librarian smiled. "I think she'd approve." "I hope so. I don't think hope is necessary." Lily looked around the room where children were already reading books purchased through the new trust. She smiled back. Neither did she.